All right, today we are diving into Japan's provisional trade statistics for December 2025, hot off the press from the Ministry of Finance. Hello, this is Japanese Economic Review Channel. Thanks so much for joining us as we break down what these latest numbers really mean for Japan's economy. Okay, let's jump right in with the big top-line numbers. These next three figures will get you a real snapshot of how things went in December. First up, total exports. And check this out. They climbed a solid 5.1% compared to the same time last year. You know, this is actually the fourth month in a row that we've seen growth, so there's some real momentum building here. Now, flipping over to the other side of the coin, we've got imports. They also saw a pretty healthy jump, rising 5.3% year on year. And just like with exports, this is the fourth straight month of growth. So we're seeing more activity on both sides. So you've got exports up, imports up. What's the bottom line? Well, it leaves Japan with a trade surplus of 105.7 billion yen. And what's really key here is that this is the second month in a row that Japan's been in the black. That's a pretty important little streak. Okay, so we've got that 30,000-foot view. Now, let's pop the hood and see what's really driving the engine. What exactly is Japan selling and buying to get these numbers? And this right here, this really tells the whole story. On the export side, the growth machine was powered by things like semiconductor parts and industrial stuff like non-ferrous metals. But on the import side, it was all about what people needed at home, communication equipment, and a huge jump in pharmaceuticals. All right, so we know what's being traded, but the big question is, with whom? Let's zoom out and take a look at Japan's biggest dance partners on the global stage. And we're going to start with the United States. And wow, the story with the US is a whole different ballgame from the overall trend. Get this, imports from the US were up a strong 9.2%, but exports to the US actually fell by over 11%. The result? Well, the trade surplus is still pretty big, but it took a serious hit, shrinking by almost a third. So what gives with that big export drop? It pretty much boils down to one thing, and it's a big one: cars. Automobile exports, which are usually the bedrock of Japan-US trade, plummeted by almost 20%. That single category had a massive, massive impact on the final numbers. Now let's hop across the pond to the European Union, where, believe it or not, the story gets even more dramatic. Exports to the EU were up just a little, about 2.6%. But just look at those imports. They absolutely skyrocketed by nearly 22%. This sent the trade deficit soaring by over 300%. Just wow. So what's going on here? Well, it's really a tale of two very different products. On one hand, car exports were actually doing okay, but that was completely washed out by a staggering almost 80% surge in pharmaceutical imports from the EU. That one category is pretty much the entire story behind that massive deficit. All right, after all that drama, let's turn our attention to Asia, which presents a much more balanced and frankly stronger picture. Exports were up over 10% and imports were right there with them, up nearly 9.6%. This kind of synchronized growth is really healthy, and it boosted the trade surplus by more than 15%. And of course, when we talk about Asia, we have to talk about China. And here, we're seeing a very familiar pattern play out. Sure, exports to China had a nice little bump of 5.6%, but imports from China grew almost 3 times faster. That pushed the deficit even wider. Now think about this. This is the 57th month in a row. That's nearly 5 straight years of a trade deficit with China. It's a defining feature of their trade relationship. Okay, so we've been deep in the weeds looking at specific products and partners. Let's pull back now and try to put all of this into a bigger context. What's the real story these numbers are trying to tell us? We kick this off by mentioning that this is the second straight month Japan has had a trade surplus. So the question on everyone's mind is this a real turning point? Is this the start of a whole new trend? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The short answer is it's probably too soon to say for sure. I mean, if you just look back at September and October, Japan was running deficits. So while having 2 positive months is definitely a good sign, it's a very, very recent shift. And you know, there's one more huge piece of this puzzle we absolutely have to talk about: the currency market. The yen was about 2.2% weaker against the dollar compared to last year. And a weaker yen basically puts a sale sign on all Japanese exports, making them cheaper for other countries to buy while making imports more expensive. So that's a massive factor playing into all of this. So let's wrap this all up. If you're going to remember three things from this month's data, make it these. First, the big picture is positive. Overall trade is growing, and we've got a second straight surplus. Second, the devil's in the details. That surplus with the US is shrinking fast thanks to cars. And third, that huge ongoing trade deficit with China, it's not going anywhere and remains a central part of Japan's trade story. So there you have it, a really complex picture of overall growth, but with some truly fascinating and maybe even worrying shifts happening with Japan's biggest partners. Thank you for watching the Japanese Economic Review. We look forward to having you with us again.